Hey guys, just wanted to wrap up what we missed in class, and as you guys are on spring break, just a few quick things. First of all, as we watch the crash course video, I recommend reviewing it once again. The biggest things in there, once again, reviewing the causes for World War I, which we use that acronym MANIA, so militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then the spark of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which led into World War I. We know that people, because of nationalism, were really pumped to go to war, were very excited, it was all for the glory, and by the time that it was over, they did not have that view and was very cynical and very angry about the death that war caused, especially kind of post-Enlightenment and all these great ideals, and here we have World War I. So a few quick things. I'm going to go through this really quick, just the things that you can write down as you're looking at this. For the next slide here, the Schlieffen Plan was basically the German plan once World War I started to basically, they wanted to go really quickly and conquer France so they didn't have to have a two-front war where they would be fighting both France but also then Russia. So they wanted to quickly defeat France, so they had the Schlieffen Plan, whereas you can kind of see on the screen here, they came in really quick through Belgium, which they're not basically fans of that, and then be able to defeat France and then be able to take on Russia. It was unsuccessful. There was a lot of Belgian resistance, because they're just trucking through their nation. And then Russians mobilized to fight faster than they expected. And so they did end up having a two-front war, both in east with Russia and a west with France. So just so you kind of are aware, the Schlieffen Plan and kind of how that worked. And so as we walk into the war, and we kind of have talked about this before, lots of people were signing up because they were excited because of nationalist reasons. So just a few pictures here: Austrian recruits, Austro-Hungarian recruits, Germans. Like, it was a big deal for people to really get involved. They were excited, pumped, and so kids were even like kind of, you can see them, how kind of idolizing what other people were doing here. The biggest thing that I want to touch on, and this is huge, and AP requires that you guys know these things, of the different new war technologies that came about from this. And so we know that the Maxim machine gun had been around before, but now that everyone has the machine gun, how that really increased casualties during the war, and also the use of poison gas. I'm just going to escape out of here really quickly, and I'm going to pull up this document here, which is this one. Just a little bit about poison gas. Germany was the first country to use the poison gas, but then basically everyone else kind of jumped on board. And so this is a little bit more about this if you wanted to pause the screen and read a little bit more about the different types of gas. Mustard gas probably was one of the more familiar ones that people have looked at in this. But basically, as you can see here, mustard gas is an almost odorless chemical which distinguished by the serious blisters it caused internally and externally, brought on several hours after exposure. So you didn't really necessarily know right away. Protection against mustard gas proved more difficult than any of the other gases, basically. It had mixed benefits. Well, it had obviously serious injury upon the enemy. The chemical remained potent in soil for weeks after the release, making it the capture of infected trenches dangerous, because if you were to use mustard gas and then take that area, you would still be susceptible to the gas as well. And so this became used a lot more post-industrialization and using these different things that they had been figuring it out. And so it was kind of a big deal within the war. If you wanted to check out a little bit more, you can pause and read some of the things on this screen to catch up on this. But then we kind of have, this is really interesting, of kind of what the effects of chlorine gas were. Flooding of the lungs, equivalent to death to drowning, only you're on dry land. Splitting headache, terrific thirst, like you can't get enough water. Knife edge pain in the lungs, coughing up greenish froth of the stomach and the lungs. And then finally, you're going to pass away. And so some of these things, as you're looking at how dangerous and how different this war was fought compared to others, looking kind of at the effects of what poison gas did. Obviously, the machine gun as well, as we're looking at trench warfare, where they dug trenches and fought out of them. We have the different tanks that people have. You can see this guy in here. You might have missed him. But we have him. We have the British tank, which really, it looks like it's quite falling apart in this picture. But tanks became used more and more as well. And I don't think we can underestimate like how big this changed how war was fought, or should have been fought, even though they used a lot of the same tactics from before. U-boats, aka submarines, were going to be used more. This is going to, as I look in just a few slides ahead, why the United States gets involved in the war. But submarine warfare, being able to patrol, being able to kind of be undetected, was going to be used more within this war. If you just look at different ships that were sunk because of U-boats and submarines, you can look around the United Kingdom and see all these different ships that were sunk between 1916 and 1917. So significant through the English Channel, which is over here, but overall. And so those are kind of what's happening. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Other new basic technologies, the airplane came about, and that's huge. When we talk about the inception of new ways to fight wars, where now it can be both in the air and on the ground, and kind of the surveillance that you can do with that, as well as surveillance with the Zeppelin. And we know some of the dangers with the Zeppelin as well, but that was used as well for surveillance during the war. Flamethrowers, I mean, we've talked about this like a really long time ago with Greek fire, but to actually be able to use this was very deadly, as well as grenade launchers. I mean, we're getting into the modern weapons, not to the extent that we have today when we get to the kind of computer age, but seriously a huge difference from purely hand-to-hand combat, which we've seen before. And so there's still that, obviously, during the war, but it's very different because it's very hard to advance on these fields and with these trenches because of the different weapons that are being used, and which is why it was so deadly at the same time. Just to kind of look through the anatomy, if you will, of trenches. This will kind of give you kind of an overview how it is. Trenches actually being the trenches, these little kind of dugout areas. And so no man's land is going to be the area between your trench and the enemy's trench. And so when you have to go over and up into no man's land, this is where many people died as they came up and out of the trenches. Otherwise, they had all these kind of things, support trenches and kind of this dugout and reserves if you had to fall back, significant, as well as the use of barbed wire, which we're going to see kind of on the next slide as well. Barbed wire was severely, I mean, just thinking of it, if you actually go over the top and into no man's land and to attack towards the enemy's trench, if you have barbed wire, once you get there, it's not easy to necessarily come into the trenches, but you have to deal with barbed wire. And especially as you're moving very quickly, this became very deadly as well. It doesn't seem like something that would be like crazy, but just thinking about it stopped people, and you would have to take time to get around or over. And sometimes people would just run into the barbed wire or get shot when they hit the barbed wire because you can't just get through it. No man's land, like we were talking about, is the area between the two different people's trenches. Going over the top is coming out of the trench and then attacking forward towards the enemy's lines, which once again was very deadly. And this is why casualties were so high, is because they were walking straight into basically machine gun fire or other weapons that were being used against them. So very deadly as we are looking at the different types of warfare that was happening and the different tools that they were using with technological advances. The United States joins the war very late. We were not very involved with World War I initially. However, what happens is the Lusitania is going to be a ship that is going to be sunk. So the Lusitania is sunk by a submarine, which we talked about before with the U-boats. And on board of the Lusitania was different was American citizens as well as others. Now, what had happened is with the Lusitania, they had published in the papers, the Germans said, like, hey, you shouldn't be traveling on, and you kind of see right here is this notice, travelers. It's kind of hard to read, but be careful if you are traveling on British ships because Britain is at war with Germany. And so you're in danger if you do this. Now, Americans still traveled. Lusitania is sunk. And we kind of have this big debate in the United States of what we should do because now Americans that kind of have died because of the war. And so we see that with the Lusitania. And then add the situation with the Lusitania sinking as well as the Zimmermann telegraph, which is really interesting. But the Germans sent this proposal to Mexico back in 1917. So the war goes from 1914 to 1918. And the British decoded this message. And basically, it says in here, if you guys can look on the left side of the screen, this is from the Germans. It said, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February, unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of all this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event that this is not successful, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis." So getting back to these alliances that we've seen back in Europe, now Germany is trying to make an alliance with Mexico that says we basically make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, because remember, they lost that to the United States. The settlement and detail is left to you. You will inform the President of the above, most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence at the same time, mediate between Japan and ourselves. So basically, they make this proposal to Mexico that if the United States gets involved, that Mexico should fight on side of Germany, which outrages the American public and gained support of the American people to join the war, because for a long time people were really campaigning in the United States that they were not going to get involved in the war. Besides the point that we were already supplying weapons and selling weapons to foreign nations, we didn't want to get actually involved. And so between the Lusitania and the situation with the Zimmerman telegraph, these are situations that led the United States to get support to join the war. And when the United States does join the war in April of 1917, excuse me, it basically, because for such a long time there had been stalemate where people were basically between the trenches just firing at each other, and they were really at a stalemate. Like, no one was really having the advantage, and more people were just being killed. And so it broke that stalemate for the support of the Allied troops, and they were able to bring in fresh troops and supplies and money, and then the Germans were able to surrender prior to even them invading Germany. Now, at the end of the war of World War I, we're going to see what the Treaty of Versailles does, but this is just a definition of total war, and that's important to understand, that a war between societies in which every available weapon is used and all of a nation's resources are devoted to the military and the home front, both being engaged in a total war, meaning that it's not just like for the United States, people were on the ground, but also back home, all of our resources. And we'll see this even more with World War II. Like, you should ration how much sugar you use, how much flour you use. Like, everybody's involved in what is happening in the war, whether you are actually boots on the ground or you're back on the home front. So that's a good definition to write down. Women are involved. Obviously, we start seeing this where you should buy Liberty bonds back in the United States, where you could be involved in different ways as a woman, how you should work at the munitions factories. And so we see women kind of hitting the workplace even more than we've seen before in the Industrial Revolution, and how they were crucial to being able, especially for the United States, be able to survive in the war, because if the women wouldn't have stepped up to do that, we wouldn't have been able to. So just some pictures of that really quick. So you should join and be involved. And here we have an English one, Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps. We see women at different places being involved. Okay, you get the point. Okay, so propaganda is big as well. We're going to talk more about this for World War II, but just kind of how they dehumanize different groups of people. We're going to see this both ways. This is an American poster where we're going to make Germans look like basically apes and brutes and kind of taking over the world. And so we'll talk more about this in the next unit as well. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. German, think of your children. You should get involved in what's happening. But at the end of the war, there's going to be an armistice with Germany. The U.S. forces reinforce the Allies, push back the Germans, and then on 11 a.m. on 11/11/1918, they end the war and say that it's going to be over. If you look at the casualties, this is really interesting that Russia actually had the highest casualties, followed by Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, etc. And then the United States is much, much lower in World War I. 10 million military deaths, 7 million civilian deaths, so 17 million people in World War I, which is a significant amount of people. At the Paris Peace Conference 1919, the Big Four, which is going to be Great Britain, Italy, France, and the United States, with Woodrow Wilson, are going to come together and have a post-war settlement. Wilson's going to put out his 14 points that's talked about in your book. One of those 14 points was the League of Nations, which later will turn into the United Nations. And then they signed the Treaty of Versailles, saying that Germany is really at fault for the entire war, and they have to agree to reparations or payments on behalf of the devastation that they caused. Interesting point about Wilson's 14 points with the League of Nations. He pitched this idea, people grabbed a hold and formed the League of Nations, but then back in the United States, we actually never joined initially. So really interesting. We just couldn't gain the support to kind of have these alliances and kind of working together in this way for kind of safety and being able to not have this happen again. So very interesting. But the Treaty of Versailles is what ultimately kind of sealed the deal of what is going to happen. And that's spelled out also in your textbook when it talks about the Treaty of Versailles and what was all in there. Where basically in 1919, as your book says, Germany lost all its colonial basically empires, anything that they had holdings. 15% of the territory of Germany they lost as well. They had to pay these huge payments to the winners of the war. They were restricted in being able to even have a military, and they had to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak, which is interesting with the wording, the outbreak of the war. This made people in Germany very resentful. And this is going to lead to the rise of Hitler eventually. But I just want you guys to be clear on these things. You really need to understand what Wilson's 14 points are. More specifically, the League of Nations is part of it, what the Treaty of Versailles was, and how that set up the scene for World War II. So have a great break.